Imagine waking up in a cold, dimly lit room, your bed made of straw, the smell of smoke from the hearth lingering in the air. Your day begins at dawn, and your survival depends not on modern comforts, but on your ability to toil, endure, and adapt to a harsh world. Welcome to medieval times, a world where survival wasn't guaranteed, and even the most basic aspects of life were a grueling challenge. In this video, we'll take you on a journey through the everyday struggles that would make modern folks think twice about romanticizing the past. In medieval times, the concept of a gentle, leisurely morning routine was a luxury reserved only for the nobility, and even they had their share of discomforts. For the average peasant, the morning began well before the first light of dawn. The rooster's crow served as a natural alarm clock, echoing through the village as the signal to rise. But unlike today's cushioned mattresses and cozy blankets, the medieval bed was a far cry from comfort. Most commoners slept on rough straw-filled mattresses, spread across wooden frames or directly on the dirt floor. The straw bedding was often infested with lice, fleas, and other pests, as it was rarely changed. Over time, the straw became packed down, musty, and laden with the grime of daily life. In the winter, the cold seeped through the thin walls, and the only source of warmth was a woolen blanket or animal skins, both of which were rarely washed. The scent of smoke from the previous night's fire lingered in the air, mingling with the earthy smell of straw and unwashed bodies. If you lived in a peasant's cottage, you likely shared your sleeping quarters with the entire family, and possibly a few animals as well. Chickens, goats, or even a pig might be brought indoors at night to protect them from thieves or predators. Their restless noises and smells would have made sleep difficult, and the morning routine even more chaotic. Upon waking, there was no time to stretch luxuriously or ease into the day. Work began immediately. The first task was to rekindle the fire, which had likely burned down to embers overnight. The hearth was the heart of the home, serving as the sole source of heat and the place where all cooking was done. If the fire had gone out completely, starting it again was a time-consuming and frustrating task. There were no matches or lighters, only flint and steel, or perhaps a bit of smouldering peat borrowed from a neighbour. Once the fire was blazing, attention turned to the animals. The family's livelihood often depended on their livestock, so the cows, goats, and chickens needed feeding and tending before anyone in the household could even think about breakfast. This meant braving the morning chill to trudge outside, sometimes barefoot, to the barn or pen. There, the animals would be milked, and fresh hay or scraps would be distributed. The air was thick with the scent of manure and wet straw, and the sounds of clucking hens and lowing cattle filled the early morning stillness. Water was another immediate concern. Unless you were fortunate enough to live near a well, fetching water was a laborious task. You would need to carry heavy wooden buckets to the nearest stream, well, or communal fountain, then haul them back home. If the water source was far away, the walk alone could take an hour or more, and if the weather was frigid, the water might be ice cold, numbing your hands as you struggled to lift and carry the heavy load. Meanwhile, if you lived in a slightly larger household or worked in a manor, your morning might involve tasks dictated by the lord or lady of the estate. Servants and serfs were expected to be up before the gentry, preparing fires in the great hall, cleaning the chamber pots, and laying out whatever meagre breakfast was available. Unlike peasants, who might break their fast with a thin porridge or stale bread, the manor's residents might expect a slightly more substantial meal, perhaps consisting of leftovers from the previous night's feast, if there had been one. For the majority of people, breakfast was not a leisurely affair. There were no steaming cups of coffee or warm toast slathered in butter. Instead, a crust of coarse, stale bread dipped in watered-down ale, or a weak pottage made from oats or barley was the norm. Meat was a rare treat for peasants, and usually reserved for special occasions or feast days. Most days, the morning meal was simply a way to stave off hunger and provide just enough energy to get through the back-breaking labour that awaited. In many cases, children were not exempt from these early morning chores. Even young boys and girls were expected to assist with feeding animals, gathering kindling, and fetching water. Their childhoods were not characterized by carefree play, but by constant, grueling work that began as soon as they were old enough to walk and carry a pail. While the nobles and clergy might rise at a slightly later hour, their mornings were still regimented and austere. Monks and nuns, for instance, adhered to a strict schedule of prayer and labour, often rising well before dawn to chant the first of many daily services. The sound of church bells ringing in the early hours was a common wake-up call throughout medieval Europe, a reminder that the church held dominion over both the time of day and the rhythms of daily life. As the sun finally crested the horizon, the village would come to life. Smoke would curl from chimneys, animals would bray and cluck, and the din of hammers, saws, and grinding millstones would signal the official start of another day. But for most medieval folk, the work had already been underway for hours. Your body ached from the hard, uneven bed. Your hands were already raw from carrying water or splitting kindling. The smell of animal dung and wood smoke clung to your clothes, and your stomach growled in protest at the thin, watery gruel you had swallowed. And with the entire day of labour ahead, there would be little time to rest until darkness fell once more. Food in medieval times was not just a matter of sustenance, it was a matter of survival. The vast majority of people lived off what they could grow, gather, or barter for, and the quality and quantity of food varied dramatically depending on the season, social status, and region. Forget the notion of a hearty, well-balanced breakfast to kickstart the day. For the common peasant, the morning meal was a sparse, utilitarian affair, often consisting of nothing more than leftover bread, gruel, or thin pottage. Bread was a staple of the medieval diet, but not the soft, fluffy loaves we know today. Most peasants ate coarse, dense bread made from barley, rye, or oats. Wheat was considered a luxury grain, reserved for the wealthier classes. The bread was dark, heavy, and often stale, having been baked days earlier. It was common to dip the bread in ale or weak beer to soften it, as it could be as hard as a rock after just a day or two. This was not the refined white bread of the nobility, but rather a heavy, gritty loaf that filled the stomach, but offered little in the way of flavour or nutrition. If bread was available, it was likely accompanied by pottage, a thick, soupy mixture of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables were in season. Pottage was the great equaliser in medieval cuisine. It could be made with virtually anything: leeks, onions, turnips, cabbage, or wild herbs. Meat was rarely included, as most livestock were too valuable to slaughter for everyday meals. Instead, pottage was flavoured with salt, if available, and perhaps a scrap of lard or a few bones saved from a previous feast day. The taste was bland, earthy, and repetitive, day after day. Ale was the most common beverage, even for breakfast. The water in medieval villages was often contaminated with bacteria, leading to frequent outbreaks of dysentery and other illnesses. Boiling the water to make ale killed harmful pathogens, making it safer to drink than untreated water. This ale was not the strong, flavourful brew of modern times, but a weak, watery concoction known as small beer. It had a low alcohol content and served as a basic source of calories and hydration. Even children drank ale, as it was considered safer than the water. The wealthy had more options for breakfast, but even their meals were modest compared to modern standards. Nobles and knights might start the day with bread made from fine wheat flour, sweetened with honey or spices, if they were especially wealthy. They might also have cheese, eggs, or leftover meat from the previous night's feast. meat was typically boiled or roasted, as frying required expensive oil or fat. A noble's breakfast might include small game birds, fish, or a sausage made from scraps of pork or beef, heavily spiced to mask the taste of slightly rancid meat. For the truly elite, breakfast could be a more elaborate affair, particularly in the households of kings and bishops. There, the kitchens might serve pastries filled with fruit or meat, eggs scrambled with herbs, or fresh milk and cream. The wealthy also had access to imported spices like cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg, which were incredibly expensive and served as status symbols as much as flavorings. Spices not only enhanced the taste of food, but also covered the smell and taste of food that was beginning to spoil. In monasteries, breakfast was dictated by religious rules. Monks and nuns followed strict dietary regulations, often eating only 1 or 2 meals a day. Breakfast might consist of a small piece of bread and a cup of watered-down ale or wine, consumed in silence during morning prayers. Some religious orders practiced regular fasting, and during certain days of the week or seasons of the year, breakfast was entirely omitted. Despite the hardships, the monasteries were often better fed than the average peasant family, as they owned vast tracts of land and received tithes and donations in the form of foodstuffs. The seasonal nature of medieval life also dictated what was available for breakfast. In the spring and summer, there might be fresh greens, wild herbs, and berries to supplement the diet. In the autumn, families preserved what they could by drying, salting, or pickling. But in the bleak winter months, fresh food was scarce, and meals became even more monotonous. Pottage thickened with stale bread or dried peas became the standard fare, and any stored grains or root vegetables were carefully rationed to last until the next harvest. For the poorest of the poor, breakfast might be nothing more than a handful of foraged nuts or a stale crust of bread scavenged from a wealthier household. Beggars and vagrants had to rely on charity, and in times of famine, even that was in short supply. Hunger was a constant companion for many, and the gnawing emptiness of an empty stomach was a sensation that most medieval people knew all too well. Hunting was technically forbidden to peasants, as the forests were reserved for the nobility. Poaching a rabbit or a deer was a crime punishable by severe penalties, but desperate times led to desperate measures. A peasant caught with a snare or trap could be fined, beaten, or worse. Still, some risked it, knowing that a single hare or pheasant could provide enough meat to feed a family for days. Despite the meagre fare, mealtime in medieval households was still a communal activity. Families gathered around the hearth to eat together, sharing what little they had, and often using bread as both plate and utensil. This communal aspect of meals reinforced social bonds and provided a brief respite from the relentless toil of daily life. For those who lived in towns or cities, breakfast could be purchased from street vendors or bakeries. The smell of fresh bread wafting through the streets was a tantalizing reminder that food, however simple, was a precious commodity. Vendors sold small pies filled with meat scraps, bowls of hot gruel, and sometimes pastries or cakes sweetened with honey or dried fruit. But these items were luxuries, and only those with disposable income could afford them regularly. Ultimately, breakfast in medieval times was not about taste or nutrition, it was about survival. Every bite was a hard-earned victory against the ever-present threat of hunger. Whether it was a crust of stale bread dipped in watery ale or a thin, tasteless pottage, the morning meal was a stark reminder that life was a constant struggle against scarcity, and for most people, the next meal was never guaranteed. In medieval times, the concept of a work day did not exist in the way we understand it today. There were no fixed hours, no weekends, and no clear division between work and rest. The daily grind was a relentless, never-ending cycle of labor that began before sunrise and continued until dusk, driven not by the ticking of a clock, but by the demands of survival. For the vast majority of the population, peasants, serfs, and labourers, the day began with physically exhausting tasks that required intense manual effort. Farming was the backbone of medieval society, and nearly every aspect of life revolved around the fields. Before the sun was fully up, men, women, and children trudged out to the fields to tend to crops, armed with basic tools like wooden ploughs, scythes, and hoes. These tools were primitive and inefficient, requiring far more physical effort than modern farming equipment. Ploughing was one of the most grueling tasks, often involving teams of oxen or, for poorer families, human power alone. The soil was heavy and unyielding, and the plough itself was a simple wooden contraption that frequently broke under the strain. Men would push and guide the plough while others followed behind, breaking up clumps of earth with hand tools. This back-breaking work could last for hours, with only brief pauses to wipe sweat from their brows and swig from a leather flask of watered-down ale. Women and children were far from exempt from the daily grind. While the men laboured in the fields, women were tasked with equally demanding chores closer to home. They rose early to grind grain into flour using a heavy, cumbersome quernstone, a task that required hours of repetitive, muscle-straining effort. The sound of grinding echoed through the village, a ceaseless rhythm that became part of the daily soundtrack of life. After the grain was ground, it was time to bake the day's bread. This was a labour-intensive process that involved kneading massive quantities of dough by hand, stoking the communal oven to the right temperature, and carefully monitoring the baking to prevent burning. Bread was the primary source of sustenance for most households, so every loaf mattered. Wasting even a single loaf could mean going hungry later in the week. Beyond bread making, women were responsible for churning butter, milking cows, gathering eggs, and preserving food for the winter months. Preserving food was a never-ending task. Without refrigeration, meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried. Vegetables were pickled or stored in root cellars, and grains were carefully sealed in clay or wooden containers to keep out rats and insects. Children, too, had their share of work. As soon as they were old enough to walk and carry small objects, they were put to work fetching water, collecting firewood, or tending to younger siblings. Boys were expected to learn the skills of their fathers, whether it was ploughing, hunting, or blacksmithing, while girls were trained to spin wool, sew, and manage the household. Playtime was virtually non-existent, and most children were treated as miniature adults, expected to contribute as much as their small hands and bodies could manage. For serfs and tenants bound to a lord's estate, the daily grind was even more punishing. Not only did they have to labour on their own small plots of land, but they were also required to work the lord's fields for a set number of days each week. This labour rent was a form of payment for the right to live on the lord's land, and it often consumed the best hours of the day, leaving little time or energy for tending to their own crops. The work on the lord's estate could be even more demanding than work at home. The manor's fields were vast, and serfs were expected to plant, weed, and harvest large quantities of grain, vegetables, and fodder. The lord's grain had to be ground at the lord's mill, and a portion of it was kept as payment for the miller. This meant that the serfs not only laboured to produce the grain, but also had to pay to have it processed, cutting into their already meagre food supplies. In addition to agricultural work, there were other vital tasks that kept the medieval village functioning. Woodcutting was an essential but dangerous job. Trees had to be felled and split into firewood, which was then hauled back to the village by oxen or carts. Wood was needed for cooking, heating, and construction, and the demand was constant. Those who ventured into the forest risked encounters with wild animals, bandits, or the Lord's foresters, who enforced strict laws against poaching and unauthorized wood gathering. Blacksmiths and carpenters also played critical roles in the village economy. The blacksmith worked tirelessly at the forge, hammering iron into tools horseshoes, nails, and weapons. The work was hot, dirty, and physically exhausting, with the sound of hammering echoing through the village. Meanwhile, the carpenter constructed everything from wooden plows to simple furniture, using rudimentary tools and raw timber that had to be cut and shaped by hand. For those living in coastal areas or near rivers, fishing was another essential aspect of the daily grind. Fishing was not a casual, leisurely activity, but a dangerous and grueling endeavor. Fishermen set out in small, fragile boats, casting nets or lines into the cold, choppy waters. The catch, if successful, had to be brought back, cleaned, and preserved quickly before it spoiled. Fish could be smoked, salted, or dried to last through the lean winter months, but the process was labor-intensive and required constant vigilance. Beyond the physical labor, there were also communal responsibilities that occupied much of the day. Roads had to be maintained, ditches dug, and fences mended. The village well needed regular cleaning, and communal ovens required constant stoking. Religious obligations also dictated the rhythm of the workday. Church bells rang at specific hours, marking the time for prayers, rest, and meals. The workday was structured around these sacred hours, with breaks for prayer, but little time for genuine rest. In cities and larger towns, the daily grind looked slightly different, but was no less demanding. Craftsmen worked long hours in cramped, smoky workshops, hammering out shoes, making barrels, or weaving cloth. Apprentices labored under the watchful eyes of their masters, performing the most menial and back-breaking tasks. Merchants hauled heavy sacks of grain, wool, or spices to market, while street vendors shouted themselves hoarse, trying to attract customers amidst the din of the crowded marketplace. For those unfortunate enough to be enslaved or indentured, the daily grind was a brutal, dehumanizing experience. Slaves and indentured servants had no legal rights, no personal time, and no control over their own labor. They were worked from sunrise to sunset, often under harsh conditions, with severe punishments for even the smallest infractions. As the sun finally began to set, the workday gradually wound down, but the labor did not stop. Evening chores awaited, feeding the animals, sweeping the hearth, mending clothing, and preparing the next day's meals. By the time the last embers of the fire dimmed and the village fell into darkness, every muscle ached, every bone felt heavy, and sleep was not so much a respite as a brief pause before the whole exhausting cycle began again the next morning. The daily grind in medieval times was a ceaseless, physically taxing routine driven by necessity, where every task was a matter of survival. There were no weekends, no holidays, and no vacations, only the relentless grinding demands of life in a world where the margin between life and death was always razor thin. Hygiene in medieval times was a concept vastly different from what we know today. Bathing, washing, and even basic cleanliness were limited by lack of access to clean water, rudimentary knowledge about disease, and deeply ingrained cultural and religious beliefs. For the average person, maintaining personal hygiene was a constant struggle against dirt, filth, and pests, and the methods available to them were primitive at best. For peasants, access to water was a daily challenge. Most villages had a communal well or stream, but hauling water was a laborious task. Buckets had to be filled, carried back to the home, and then heated over an open fire if warm water was desired. Bathing, therefore, was not a daily or even a weekly occurrence. Instead, most people washed themselves infrequently, perhaps once a month or on major holy days. When they did bathe, it was often in the same water used by other family members, starting with the father, then the mother, followed by the children, and finally the baby. By the time the last person climbed in, the water was murky and tepid, filled with dirt, sweat, and grime. For those who could not access a tub, a basic wash was performed using a cloth and a basin of water. This method involved scrubbing the face, hands, and feet, considered the dirtiest parts of the body. But little attention was given to the rest of the body. Soap, if it was available, was a rough, caustic concoction made from animal fat and wood ash. It was harsh on the skin, left a greasy residue, and was used sparingly. In some cases, people used sand, ashes, or dried herbs to scrub away dirt. But these abrasive methods could cause skin irritation and did little to eliminate body odor. Odor was an inevitable part of daily life. People sweated constantly while working, and the layers of wool and linen they wore absorbed sweat and grime. Since clothing was rarely washed, both due to the labor involved and the risk of wearing out the fabric, most people walked around in filthy, foul-smelling garments. To mask the stench, they rubbed themselves with herbs like rosemary, lavender, or mint, or carried small pouches of dried flowers called pomanders. However, these measures only masked the odor temporarily and did nothing to address the underlying filth. Hair care was equally challenging. Without modern shampoos, people washed their hair infrequently, perhaps once a month or less. Instead, they relied on simple rinses made from vinegar, herbs, or even stale beer. These rinses helped to reduce grease and odor, but did little to prevent lice and other pests. Lice were rampant in medieval society, and people of all social classes were plagued by them. Combing the hair with a fine-toothed comb was the most common method of control, but this was a tedious and often ineffective process. Lice and fleas were more than just an annoyance. They were a constant, biting reality. Straw mattresses, animal hides, and even clothing provided the perfect breeding ground for these pests. People would wake up covered in bites, scratching incessantly throughout the day. To combat the infestation, some sprinkled their bedding with dried lavender or wormwood, believing that the scent would repel the insects. Others boiled their clothes to kill the pests. But this practice was not common due to the labor-intensive nature of boiling water and the risk of damaging fragile fabrics. For the wealthy, bathing was more elaborate but still infrequent. Nobles and royalty had access to bathhouses or private wooden tubs, which were filled with hot water carried by servants. Scented oils, rose petals, and herbs were added to the bath to perfume the water and soften the skin. Bathing was seen as a luxurious indulgence, a way to relax as well as cleanse, but even the wealthy did not bathe daily. Instead, they relied on perfumes, powders, and fine linens to cover up body odor. Monks and nuns adhered to strict routines regarding cleanliness, but even in monasteries, bathing was limited. Religious orders believed that excessive bathing was a sign of vanity and could lead to sinful thoughts. As a result, monks and nuns might bathe only a few times a year, often as part of a religious ritual or during the preparation for a major feast day. Instead of bathing, they wiped themselves down with damp cloths and sprinkled their robes with fragrant herbs. Dental hygiene was another neglected aspect of medieval life. Toothbrushes did not exist, and the concept of dental care was rudimentary at best. Some people chewed on twigs or rinsed their mouths with wine or vinegar to freshen their breath, but tooth decay and gum disease were rampant. The wealthy sometimes used toothpicks made of gold or ivory to remove bits of food, but for the average peasant, even this simple luxury was out of reach. Toothaches were treated with poultices made of herbs, and in extreme cases, the offending tooth was yanked out with crude metal pliers, often without the benefit of anesthetic. Public bathhouses existed in larger towns and cities, but they were not solely used for bathing. These bathhouses were places of socialization, gossip, and in some cases, illicit activities. Men and women bathed separately, but the mingling that occurred afterward was a source of moral concern for the church, which eventually condemned public bathhouses as dens of vice and sin. By the late medieval period, many bathhouses had been closed or fallen into disrepair further limiting people's access to bathing facilities. Sanitation in medieval cities was abysmal. Human waste was tossed into the streets, chamber pots were emptied out of windows, and animal dung littered the alleyways. Open sewers ran through the streets, carrying filth and waste to nearby rivers or ditches. The stench was overwhelming, especially in the summer months, and the risk of disease was ever present. Rats and other vermin thrived in the squalor, spreading diseases like the plague, which decimated populations with terrifying speed. In rural areas, latrines were basic pits dug away from the home or simple wooden outhouses with a hole over a cesspit. These were breeding grounds for flies, and waste often seeped into the surrounding soil, contaminating nearby water sources. Some wealthier households had garderobes, small closet-like rooms built into castle walls that allowed waste to drop down into a moat or pit below. However, these systems were rudimentary and far from sanitary. Hand-washing was another neglected practice. Although some people washed their hands before meals as a sign of courtesy, the concept of germs was unknown, and most hand-washing was perfunctory at best. Since water was scarce and often filthy, many people simply wiped their hands on their clothes or on communal towels that were rarely cleaned. This lack of basic hygiene contributed to the spread of diseases, which could wipe out entire villages in a matter of weeks. Despite the squalor, there were attempts at cleanliness. Herbs and flowers were used to mask odors, and some people believed that strong scents could ward off disease. Apothecaries sold concoctions of rosewater, vinegar, and lavender to sprinkle on clothing and linens. Wealthier households might burn aromatic herbs like sage or juniper to purify the air. But these measures did little to address the root causes of filth and disease. Hygiene in medieval times was a grim affair, a constant losing battle against dirt, lice, and disease. People adapted to the stench and filth, accepting it as a natural part of life. Bathing was rare, cleanliness was relative, and the concept of sanitation was practically non-existent. In a world where survival was the primary concern, personal hygiene was often an afterthought, a luxury for the few and an unattainable dream for the many. Eating in medieval times was not a simple, relaxed affair, but a constant struggle against scarcity, monotony, and poor nutrition. The availability of food was dictated by the seasons, the success or failure of harvests, and one's social status. For peasants, the diet was basic, repetitive, and often insufficient to meet daily caloric needs. Meals were centered around whatever could be grown locally or foraged from the surrounding landscape, with little variety and minimal access to luxury ingredients. For the average peasant, bread was the cornerstone of every meal. Made from coarse, dark grains like barley, rye, or oats, the bread was dense, heavy, and difficult to digest. Unlike the soft, airy loaves we eat today, medieval bread was more like a compact, gritty slab. Flour was often mixed with ground acorns, beans, or even sawdust to stretch the supply, especially during times of famine. The resulting bread was filling but nutritionally poor, and in lean years, it was sometimes the only sustenance available. In addition to bread, peasants relied heavily on pottage, a thick, porridge-like stew made from grains, beans, and vegetables. The ingredients varied with the seasons, but staples included onions, leeks, cabbage, and turnips. Meat was a rare addition, reserved for special occasions, or when a chicken was too old to lay eggs. Pottage simmered over the hearth all day, with new ingredients added as they became available, making it a perpetual stew that changed subtly in flavour from one day to the next. Proteins were scarce for peasants. Meat was considered a luxury, and most peasants only ate it a few times a year, usually during feasts or religious celebrations. Hunting was strictly controlled by the nobility, and poaching was a crime punishable by severe fines or imprisonment. Those who dared to set snares for rabbits or deer risked harsh punishment if caught. Instead, peasants relied on eggs, occasional fish, and whatever small game they could trap, such as squirrels, birds, or hedgehogs. Fish was more common in coastal regions or near rivers, but even then, it was not always accessible. The church mandated numerous fasting days when meat consumption was forbidden, making fish the primary source of protein for those who could afford it. However, in inland areas, fresh fish was hard to come by, and salted or dried fish became the standard. Salted herring, in particular, was a staple, but it was tough, leathery, and required hours of soaking and boiling to make it edible. Dairy products were more common than meat, but still limited. Cows and goats provided milk, but fresh milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration. As a result, most milk was turned into butter or cheese. Butter was often rancid, especially during the summer months when it was stored in hot, smoky kitchens. Cheese, on the other hand, could be aged and preserved, becoming a crucial protein source during the winter. Most cheeses were simple, hard and salty, more functional than flavorful. Vegetables were a significant part of the peasant diet, but they were not the colorful array we imagine today. Potatoes, tomatoes, and corn had not yet been introduced from the New World, so the available vegetables were limited to root crops, leafy greens, and legumes. Turnips, onions, leeks, and beans were common, and they were often boiled into pottage or mashed into pastes. The monotony of these vegetables was occasionally broken by wild herbs and edible flowers gathered from the woods. However, some plants were toxic or unpalatable, and people had to be cautious when foraging. Fruit was highly seasonal and reserved for the summer and early autumn months. Apples, pears, plums, and berries were gathered when ripe and either eaten fresh or dried for later use. Fruit preservation was rudimentary, involving drying, salting, or fermenting. Sweeteners like honey were scarce and expensive, so fruit was often sour or bland. Occasionally, a wealthy landowner might allow peasants to collect windfall fruit from the orchard, but most peasants had to rely on what they could forage or grow themselves. Seasonings and spices were luxuries that few could afford. Salt was the most common seasoning, but it was costly and difficult to obtain. It was essential for preserving meat and fish, so it was carefully rationed. Herbs like parsley, thyme, and rosemary grew in small garden plots, but exotic spices like cinnamon, pepper, and cloves were imported from distant lands and cost more than most peasants earned in a year. Only the nobility could afford such luxuries, and they used them liberally to demonstrate their wealth and sophistication. Drinks were another significant aspect of the medieval diet. Clean drinking water was a rarity, especially in towns where rivers and wells were often contaminated by human and animal waste. Instead, people drank weak ale, a low-alcohol brew that was safer than water due to the brewing process. Even children drank ale, as it was more nutritious and less likely to carry disease. In areas with access to vineyards, wine was also consumed, though it was typically reserved for the wealthy. The poor might drink thin, watered-down wine or fermented cider made from leftover fruit scraps. Feasting was a rare and cherished event for peasants, marking holy days, weddings, or the end of the harvest season. During these occasions, meat was served in greater quantities, sometimes as part of a communal stew or roasted over an open fire. Pies filled with meat, vegetables, and coarse flour crusts were a special treat, though they were dense and heavy compared to modern pastries. Ale and cider flowed freely, and villagers sang, danced, and celebrated until the food and drink ran out. For the nobility, dining was a spectacle of excess and extravagance. While peasants struggled to fill their bellies with pottage and black bread, the upper classes feasted on roasted game, fresh fish, and delicacies like swan, peacock, and venison. Meals were served in multiple courses, each accompanied by elaborate sauces spiced with imported cinnamon, saffron, and ginger. The presentation was as important as the food itself, with dishes shaped to resemble castles, animals, or mythical creatures. feasts were a display of wealth and power, reinforcing social hierarchies and impressing guests with ostentatious displays of abundance. Despite the contrast between peasant and noble diets, both were susceptible to scarcity and famine. Crop failures, harsh winters, or infestations could wipe out entire food supplies, leading to widespread hunger and starvation. In such times, people resorted to eating bark, roots, and even leather to survive. Bread was stretched with sawdust or ground acorns, and pottage became little more than thin gruel. The desperation of hunger led to disease outbreaks and increased mortality, especially among the poor, who had no reserves to fall back on. Foodborne illness was another constant threat. Without proper storage or cooking techniques, meat quickly spoiled and became infested with maggots or flies. Fish left unrefrigerated for even a day could become dangerously toxic. People relied on their senses, sight, smell, and taste, to judge food safety, but without modern knowledge of bacteria and pathogens, they often consumed tainted food unknowingly. Illnesses like dysentery, food poisoning, and parasitic infections were rampant, weakening already malnourished bodies and increasing the death toll. Eating in medieval times was not just about sustenance, it was a daily battle against hunger, disease, and social inequality. The disparity between peasant and noble diets underscored the rigid class structure, while the constant threat of famine loomed over every meal. For the poor, food was fuel, scarce and precious. For the rich, it was a display of power, excess, and wealth. And for everyone, it was a reminder of how precarious life was in a world where a single bad harvest could mean the difference between life and death. Daily life in medieval times was a constant cycle of toil, routine, and survival, marked by strict social hierarchies and deeply ingrained customs. For the average peasant, life was grueling, monotonous, and physically exhausting. From dawn until dusk, the day revolved around work. Endless, back-breaking labor aimed at producing just enough food to keep hunger at bay. The day began with the rising sun, often around 4 or 5 a.m., depending on the season. Peasants awoke in small, crowded single-room cottages made of wattle and daub with thatched roofs. The floors were usually dirt, sometimes covered with a layer of straw that absorbed waste and filth, making the air perpetually damp and rancid. Families slept on straw-filled mattresses or rough wooden pallets, and in many households, humans and livestock shared the same space for warmth. Chickens clucked in the corners, pigs rooted through scraps, and the occasional dog or cat roamed freely. Upon waking, the first task was to stoke the hearth fire, which had likely burned down to embers overnight. The hearth was the center of domestic life, used for cooking, warmth, and light. Without matches or modern ignition methods, starting a fire was a laborious process involving flint, steel, and tinder. Once the fire was rekindled, a simple breakfast was prepared, usually consisting of coarse bread, porridge, or leftover pottage. Meat was a rarity, and fresh milk, if available, was consumed quickly before it soured. After breakfast, men and older boys headed to the fields to work the land. The primary focus was agriculture, as most peasants were tenant farmers or serfs bound to a lord's estate. They ploughed fields with heavy crude wooden ploughs pulled by oxen, sowed seeds by hand, and weeded crops with basic tools. The work was backbreaking, repetitive, and performed in all weather conditions: blazing sun, driving rain, or biting cold. Blisters, calloused hands, and aching backs were constant companions. Women's work was equally demanding but centered around the home. They fetched water from the nearest well or stream, a task that could take hours if the water source was far away. Water had to be carried in heavy wooden buckets, and it was used sparingly, reserved for cooking, washing, and drinking. Women also prepared meals over open fires, kneaded and baked bread, churned butter, and preserved whatever food they could for the lean winter months. Laundry was washed by hand in icy streams or wooden tubs, using harsh lye soap that cracked and burned the skin. In addition to these daily chores, women were responsible for caring for the children and tending to small livestock, such as chickens, goats, or pigs. They collected eggs, milked goats or cows, and slaughtered animals when necessary. Animal waste was collected for fertilizer, adding another layer of unpleasantness to already grueling days. Women also spun wool or flax into thread using drop spindles or rudimentary looms, a time-consuming task that could take hours to produce a single skein of yarn. Children were not exempt from work. From a young age, they were expected to contribute to the household's labour. Boys worked alongside their fathers in the fields, learning how to plough, plant and harvest crops. Girls helped their mothers with domestic tasks, fetching water, preparing meals, and tending to younger siblings. Education was minimal or non-existent for most peasant children, as survival took precedence over literacy. The few children who did receive education were typically boys sent to monasteries to study under monks, and even then, it was a privilege reserved for the wealthier or more pious families. The rhythm of the day was dictated by the natural light and the church bells that marked the hours. Work continued until midday, when a brief break was taken for the main meal, usually a bowl of pottage or a slice of bread with a piece of cheese or some dried fish. This meal was consumed quickly, often in silence, and then it was back to work until the setting sun signaled the end of the Labour Day. Evening was a time for more domestic chores, and the hearth fire became the focal point of family life. Dinner was typically a repeat of lunch, more bread, pottage, or gruel. With little to no access to sugar or spices, the food was bland and monotonous, filling but unappealing. After dinner, families gathered around the fire to mend clothing, spin wool, or simply talk. Without books or other forms of entertainment, storytelling became a primary source of amusement, with tales of local legends, saints, and the occasional ghost story. For the wealthy, daily life was markedly different. Nobles and landowners lived in manor houses or castles, surrounded by servants who performed the menial tasks that peasants did for themselves. Noblemen spent their days overseeing their estates, attending to legal matters, or training for combat. Hunting was a favourite pastime, and it was as much about demonstrating power and skill as it was about acquiring food. They hunted deer, boar, and other game, often with trained falcons or packs of dogs. Noblewomen managed the household, directing servants and ensuring that the family's clothing, food, and finances were in order. They spent hours embroidering, sewing, and instructing their daughters in the domestic arts. Noble children were taught to read, write, and speak Latin, and boys were trained in the skills of knighthood, sword fighting, jousting, and horse riding. Girls, on the other hand, were groomed for marriage, their futures determined by strategic alliances rather than personal choice. Religious observance was a significant part of daily life for both rich and poor. The church was the center of the community, a place where people gathered not only to worship, but also to receive news, socialize, and settle disputes. The ringing of church bells marked the canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, structuring the day around prayer and work. Sunday was a mandatory day of rest, with attendance at Mass expected of all, regardless of status. For monks and nuns, daily life was governed by a strict schedule of prayer, work, and contemplation. Monastic life was austere, with simple meals, sparse accommodations, and rigorous adherence to the rule of Saint Benedict or other religious guidelines. Monks rose before dawn for the first prayer service and spent the day copying manuscripts, tending gardens, or caring for the sick. Silence was often required, fostering a contemplative atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the noise and chaos of peasant life. Festivals and holy days provided rare breaks from the relentless routine. Feast days marked the birthdays of saints or significant religious events, and they were occasions for communal feasting, dancing, and games. People gathered in village squares to watch jugglers, musicians, and storytellers, temporarily escaping the hardships of daily life. For the wealthy, feasts were elaborate affairs with multiple courses, entertainment, and expensive delicacies. For the poor, it was a chance to eat a bit more meat, drink ale, and enjoy a brief respite from labor. Despite the rigid routines, life was unpredictable and precarious. Accidents, illness, and sudden changes in weather could disrupt even the most carefully planned day. A simple injury sustained while chopping wood could fester and become life-threatening due to lack of medical knowledge and poor hygiene. A single hailstorm could devastate a crop, leading to months of hunger. A minor dispute with a lord or landowner could result in punishment, eviction, or worse. Daily life in medieval times was a relentless grind, a struggle to survive in a world defined by hardship and uncertainty. The routines of work, prayer, and meager sustenance created a rhythm that was both monotonous and grueling, a stark contrast to the comforts and conveniences of modern life. For those who lived it, each day was a battle against the elements, against poverty, and against the unyielding demands of a society that offered little reprieve from the relentless cycle of toil. Medical care in medieval times was a bewildering combination of superstition, rudimentary herbal remedies, and primitive surgical techniques. The understanding of the human body was limited, and diseases were often attributed to divine punishment, demonic possession, or imbalances in the body's four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These humours, a concept inherited from ancient Greek and Roman medicine, dominated medical thought throughout the medieval period. Maintaining a balance among them was considered essential to health, and any illness was thought to result from an excess or deficiency of one or more humours. Doctors, or more accurately, physicians, were a rarity, and their services were reserved for the wealthy. Most common folk relied on local healers, midwives, monks, or wise women who dispensed simple remedies made from herbs, roots, and animal parts. These healers were usually self-taught or learned their craft through apprenticeships. Medical texts were scarce, expensive, and written in Latin, making them inaccessible to the average person. Instead, knowledge was passed down orally and adapted over generations. One of the most common treatments in medieval medicine was bloodletting. The belief was that illness resulted from an excess of blood, and by draining some of it, the balance of the humours could be restored. This practice was performed using leeches, cupping glasses, or by making incisions with a lancet. The process was crude and often performed by barbers who were more skilled at wielding blades than diagnosing ailments. Unsanitary conditions, dirty instruments, and a lack of understanding of infection meant that bloodletting often did more harm than good. Infections, blood loss, and even death were not uncommon outcomes. Leeching was particularly popular as it was seen as less invasive than cutting the skin. Leeches were applied to the body, particularly to areas believed to be congested with bad blood. The leeches would suck blood until they were engorged, a process that could take hours. Despite its ineffectiveness and risks, leeching persisted as a common treatment for centuries. Even monarchs and nobles were subjected to this gruesome practice, as it was believed to cleanse the body of impurities. Surgery in medieval times was a last resort, and it was as terrifying as it was dangerous. Without anesthesia, patients were fully conscious throughout the procedure, enduring excruciating pain as the surgeon cut, sawed, or cauterized their flesh. The most common surgical procedures were amputations, lancing abscesses, and extracting arrowheads. Surgeons, who were often barbers by trade, possessed basic tools like knives, saws, and scalpels, but lacked any knowledge of antiseptics or sterilization. Wounds were frequently treated by cauterization, a practice that involved searing the flesh with a hot iron to stop bleeding and close the wound. The searing pain was unbearable, and many patients died of shock or infection. Infection was almost inevitable, as surgical tools were reused without proper cleaning, spreading bacteria and disease from one patient to another. The concept of bacteria would not be understood until centuries later, so infections were attributed to bad air, curses, or moral failings. Fractures and broken bones were treated with crude splints made of wood, cloth, or leather. The injured limb was wrapped tightly to immobilize it, but improper setting often resulted in permanent deformities or loss of function. Gangrene was a constant threat, and if the tissue began to rot, the only solution was amputation. Amputation was a nightmarish ordeal performed with a saw, without anesthesia, and with only the most basic attempts to stem the bleeding. Patients were often given strong alcohol or opiates to dull the pain, but these were hardly sufficient. Dental care was virtually non-existent for the average person. Toothaches and abscesses were treated by tooth pullers, who yanked teeth out with crude forceps, causing intense pain and often leaving behind splinters of bone or infected gums. Herbal remedies were sometimes applied to numb the pain, but dental hygiene was minimal, and tooth decay was rampant. Tooth pullers roamed from town to town, setting up shop in marketplaces and extracting teeth in public displays, much to the horror of onlookers. Mental illness was poorly understood and often attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment. Those suffering from conditions like schizophrenia, epilepsy, or severe depression were sometimes labeled as witches or possessed and subjected to exorcisms, beatings, or imprisonment. In extreme cases, they were confined to asylums, which were little more than prisons where the mentally ill were chained, beaten, and neglected. Compassion and understanding were rare, and most mentally ill individuals were feared, ostracized, or exploited as curiosities. Women in medieval times faced particularly harsh medical conditions. Pregnancy and childbirth were fraught with danger, as complications like hemorrhage, infection, and obstructed labor were common and often fatal. Midwives who served as the primary caregivers for pregnant women relied on herbal remedies, prayers, and rudimentary birthing techniques. Forceps were not yet in use, and if a baby became stuck during delivery, both mother and child were at great risk of dying. Many women died in childbirth or shortly after due to postpartum infections, a condition known as childbed fever. Infant mortality rates were staggeringly high. Without vaccinations, antibiotics, or proper nutrition, infants succumbed to infections, malnutrition, or congenital conditions that were untreatable at the time. Children who survived infancy faced further dangers, as diseases like smallpox, measles, and dysentery swept through villages with alarming regularity. Even minor injuries could become life-threatening if they became infected, as gangrene and tetanus were common killers. Despite the grim realities of medieval medicine, some forms of treatment offered genuine relief. Herbalism, practiced by wise women, monks, and local healers, provided remedies made from plants like lavender, chamomile, and yarrow. These herbs were used to treat ailments ranging from headaches to digestive issues, and were often more effective than the more aggressive methods employed by physicians. Salves made from honey, garlic, and onion were applied to wounds, as their mild antibacterial properties helped to stave off infection. Monasteries also served as centers of medical knowledge, housing small infirmaries where monks treated the sick with herbal remedies, poultices, and prayers. Monks kept records of their treatments and often copied medical texts from ancient Greece and Rome, preserving valuable knowledge that would later lay the foundation for more advanced medical practices. Astrology also played a role in medical treatment. as physicians believed that the alignment of the planets influenced health and disease. Medical charts were drawn up to determine the best time for bloodletting, surgery, or the administration of certain remedies. The zodiac was consulted to identify which body parts were ruled by which celestial bodies, a practice that, while based in superstition, was widely accepted as legitimate science. Superstition was pervasive in medieval medicine, with many illnesses attributed to curses, evil spirits, or divine retribution. Amulets, charms, and talismans were worn to ward off sickness, and incantations were whispered over the sick to drive out malevolent forces. Certain stones, herbs, or animal parts were believed to possess magical properties and were carried as protective tokens. While these practices had no scientific basis, they offered psychological comfort in a world where suffering was constant and medical understanding was rudimentary at best. Ultimately, medieval medicine was a patchwork of archaic theories, crude surgical techniques, and folk remedies that, while often ineffective, provided a semblance of hope in a society plagued by disease and death. The poor suffered most, with little access to trained physicians and no means to afford expensive treatments. For them, the only recourse was to endure pain, pray for healing, or accept their fate, however grim it might be. Meanwhile, the wealthy clung to elaborate but largely useless treatments administered by educated but misguided physicians, whose Latin texts offered more mysticism than medicine. In the end, the medieval approach to health and healing was a dark reflection of the times, harsh, unpredictable, and deeply rooted in fear of the unknown. Medieval justice was a harsh and unforgiving system, rooted in the belief that crime was not only an offence against the victim, but also an affront to the moral order established by God and the ruling authorities. The legal framework was a chaotic blend of customary law, royal decrees, religious edicts, and feudal codes, with little consistency or predictability. Justice was not blind, but heavily influenced by social status, wealth, and connections. The powerful could often escape punishment, while the poor and powerless bore the full brunt of the law. For the majority of people living in medieval Europe, the local manor court was the first and most immediate source of justice. These courts were presided over by the local lord or his appointed steward, who acted as both judge and jury. Manor courts dealt primarily with petty offences like theft, disputes over land, and breaches of feudal obligations. If a peasant stole a neighbour's chicken, failed to pay rent, or got into a brawl, he would be hauled before the manor court. The accused had little chance to defend themselves, as there were no lawyers or legal representation for common folk. The Lord's word was law, and his decisions were rarely questioned. In more serious cases, such as murder, arson, or treason, the accused would be sent to a higher court, such as a royal court or ecclesiastical court. Royal courts were under the jurisdiction of the king or his appointed judges, and they dealt with crimes that threatened the peace of the realm, such as murder, rebellion, and large-scale theft. Ecclesiastical courts, on the other hand, handled cases involving clergy, religious disputes, heresy, and moral offences like adultery or blasphemy. The church wielded tremendous influence over the legal system, and in many instances, clerics accused of crimes were tried in church courts, where the penalties were often less severe than in secular courts. One of the most infamous aspects of medieval justice was the use of trial by ordeal, a practice based on the belief that God would reveal the truth through supernatural intervention. There were several forms of ordeal, each more brutal than the last. Ordeal by fire involved making the accused walk over hot coals or hold a red-hot iron bar. If their burns healed cleanly within a set period, they were declared innocent. If the wounds festered, they were guilty. Ordeal by water was similarly brutal. The accused was bound and thrown into a body of water. If they floated, it was seen as a sign of guilt. As water, a pure element, was believed to reject them. If they sank, they were innocent, but they might drown in the process. Another common method was ordeal by combat, a trial where the accused and the accuser fought each other, sometimes to the death. The outcome was considered a divine judgment. Noblemen could hire champions to fight in their place, but commoners had to defend themselves. Those unable to fight were at a severe disadvantage, and many innocent people were maimed or killed simply because they were physically weaker than their accusers. Torture was another grim reality of medieval justice, especially in cases involving serious crimes or suspected heresy. While torture was officially sanctioned only in certain cases, it was widely employed as a means of extracting confessions regardless of the truth. Torture chambers were dark, foreboding places filled with instruments of unimaginable cruelty. The rack, for instance, stretched the body until joints dislocated and bones snapped. The thumbscrew crushed fingers, and the strappado hoisted victims into the air by their wrists, which were tied behind their backs, dislocating shoulders and causing intense agony. Confessions obtained under torture were considered valid, even though victims would often confess to anything to end the suffering. This led to false confessions, wrongful convictions, and the execution of countless innocent people. In cases of suspected witchcraft or heresy, torture was almost guaranteed, as the authorities sought to uncover not only the supposed crimes of the accused, but also the names of accomplices. Thus, entire communities could be implicated based on a single coerced confession. For those found guilty of serious crimes, punishments were severe and public. Executions were held in town squares or marketplaces, drawing large crowds eager to witness the spectacle. Hanging was the most common method for thieves and murderers, with the condemned paraded through the streets to the gallows, where they were hanged by the neck until dead. In some cases, particularly for traitors or those convicted of particularly heinous crimes, hanging was followed by disembowelment, dismemberment, and beheading. The severed body parts were often displayed on spikes or city gates as a grim warning to others. Burning at the stake was the preferred punishment for heretics, witches, and those convicted of particularly egregious offences against the church. The condemned were tied to a wooden stake, surrounded by kindling, and set ablaze. The crowd would gather to watch as the flames consumed the victim, chanting prayers or hurling insults. The process was excruciatingly slow, and death could take hours. Occasionally, as a merciful gesture, executioners would strangle the condemned before lighting the fire, but this was not always the case. For those convicted of lesser crimes, punishments were designed to humiliate and deter. The pillory and stocks were common forms of public shaming. In the pillory, the condemned person's head and hands were locked into wooden holes, leaving them vulnerable to public ridicule. Onlookers would throw rotten food, excrement, or stones, sometimes causing serious injury. The stocks confined the feet, making it impossible for the accused to move or escape as they were pelted with garbage and insults. Branding was another common punishment. Thieves, adulterers, and other offenders had their skin seared with hot irons bearing specific symbols that identified their crime. These marks served as a lifelong reminder of their transgressions and a warning to others. Mutilation was also practiced in certain cases. Thieves might have their ears, hands, or fingers cut off, while blasphemers could have their tongues pierced or removed. These punishments not only inflicted lasting physical damage, but also served as a visible mark of shame, making it nearly impossible for the offender to reintegrate into society. Debt was another area where the medieval justice system showed little mercy. Debtors who could not repay loans were thrown into debtors' prisons, where they languished in squalor, often for years. Unlike modern prisons, medieval jails were overcrowded, filthy, and disease-ridden. Prisoners relied on family or charity to provide food, as the authorities did not feed them. Those without means could starve or succumb to illness while awaiting trial or execution. Despite its brutality, medieval justice was not entirely devoid of order or rationality. Some communities implemented systems of compensation known as vergild, a practice inherited from Germanic law. Rather than executing a murderer, the offender or their family could pay a sum of money to the victim's family as compensation. This system, though imperfect, allowed for restitution without bloodshed, but it was reserved primarily for disputes between nobles or wealthy families. Over time, the justice system began to evolve, particularly as royal courts and centralized authority grew stronger. The use of written laws became more common, and some semblance of due process emerged. Juries began to replace ordeals, and magistrates gained the authority to assess evidence and pass judgment. However, corruption remained rampant, and bribery was a common means of escaping punishment. Ultimately, medieval justice was less about fairness and more about maintaining order and reinforcing the power of the ruling class. For the poor and powerless, it was a terrifying system where minor infractions could result in life-altering punishment, and accusations alone could lead to death. The cruelty of medieval justice served as both a deterrent and a spectacle, a grim reminder that in a world ruled by fear, survival often depended on remaining unnoticed and unquestioning. Medieval sanitation was virtually non-existent, and the consequences of poor hygiene were felt in every aspect of daily life. Streets were filthy, water sources were contaminated, and personal cleanliness was almost an afterthought for most people. The vast majority of medieval towns lacked organized sewage systems, leading to a buildup of waste that attracted vermin, spread disease, and made life unbearably foul for everyone. Streets in medieval towns were often little more than dirt paths, and these paths quickly became cesspools of refuse. People threw garbage, human waste, and animal dung directly onto the streets, where it accumulated in open gutters. The stench was overpowering, particularly in summer, and swarms of flies and rats thrived in the filth. But despite the obvious health hazards, this was considered normal. The concept of sanitation as we understand it today simply did not exist, and few people link the filth to the spread of disease. The lack of proper waste disposal was not only a public nuisance, but also a serious health hazard. Human waste was often collected in chamber pots, which were then emptied into the streets or nearby rivers. In larger towns, some houses had privies, small, rudimentary outhouses built over cesspits. These cesspits were shallow holes in the ground that would fill up over time, forcing their owners to either dig new ones or hire gong farmers to empty them. Gong farmers, also known as night soil men, were responsible for shoveling out the excrement, a filthy and dangerous job that exposed them to all manner of diseases. They worked only at night, hauling away the waste to dump it outside the town walls, where it continued to fester and breed infection. Water sources were particularly vulnerable to contamination. Rivers, wells, and public fountains were the primary sources of drinking water, but these same sources were also used for washing clothes, disposing of waste, and slaughtering animals. Blood, entrails, and offal from butcher shops were routinely dumped into rivers, polluting the water with bacteria and pathogens. Wells, too, were susceptible to contamination, as waste seeping from nearby cesspits could easily leach into the groundwater. Drinking untreated water was a gamble, and outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever were common, especially in crowded towns and cities. Bathing was a luxury that most commoners could not afford. Public bathhouses did exist, particularly in larger cities, but they were associated with sin and moral decay, as they often doubled as brothels. Monks and nuns were more likely to bathe than the average peasant, as religious orders valued cleanliness, but even they bathed infrequently, perhaps once a month. The average peasant might bathe once or twice a year, if at all. Instead, they relied on rudimentary washing with cold water, often in communal areas or rivers, where the same water was used by dozens of other people. Soap was a rare commodity, made from animal fat and ashes, and it was not widely used outside of monasteries and wealthy households. The poor could not afford it, and even those who had access to it used it sparingly. Without soap, the ability to remove dirt, sweat, and bacteria was severely limited. Lice, fleas, and other parasites flourished in the grime, spreading diseases such as typhus and plague. Bedbugs infested straw mattresses, and rats nested in the thatched roofs, further compounding the unsanitary conditions. In the absence of regular bathing, people resorted to masking body odor with perfumes or herbs. The wealthy could afford scented oils and pomanders, small, perforated containers filled with fragrant substances. These were worn around the neck or carried in hand to ward off foul smells. The poor, however, had no such options and simply endured the pervasive stench. The heavy, layered clothing typical of the medieval period also contributed to body odor, as garments were rarely washed and could absorb sweat and filth for months before being cleaned. Dental hygiene was practically non-existent. Toothbrushes, as we know them, did not exist, and most people never brushed their teeth. Instead, they might chew on twigs or rinse their mouths with water. The wealthy sometimes used toothpicks made of gold, silver, or bone, but these were ineffective at removing plaque or preventing decay. Sugar, though rare, was considered a luxury and was often consumed in large quantities by the nobility, leading to rotted, blackened teeth. The poor, who could not afford sugar, had slightly better dental health, but they still suffered from toothaches, abscesses, and tooth loss. When dental pain became unbearable, the only solution was to have the offending tooth yanked out by a local barber surgeon or a travelling tooth puller. These extractions were done without anesthesia, using crude tools that often broke the tooth, left splinters behind, or tore the gums. Infection was a common outcome, and those who survived the ordeal were left with gaping holes in their mouths, making eating and speaking difficult. Plague and pestilence were rampant in medieval towns, largely due to the unsanitary conditions. The most notorious example, of course, was the Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century and killed an estimated 25 to 30 million people. The plague was spread by fleas carried by rats, and the rats thrived in the filth of medieval cities. Streets littered with waste provided an ideal breeding ground for rodents, and the lack of effective waste management only exacerbated the problem. Efforts to control the rat population were primitive and largely ineffective. Cats were sometimes employed to catch rodents, but they were also associated with witchcraft and were often killed during witch hunts. Ironically, the persecution of cats may have contributed to the spread of the plague, as the rat population soared without natural predators to keep it in check. In some towns, authorities made half-hearted attempts to clean the streets by appointing rakers to sweep up waste, or by establishing designated dumping grounds for refuse. However, these efforts were sporadic and poorly enforced. Some towns imposed fines for dumping waste in the streets, but such laws were difficult to enforce, and most people continued to dispose of their garbage wherever was most convenient. Religious beliefs also influenced medieval attitudes toward cleanliness. Some people believed that bathing too frequently was sinful or indulgent, as it involved exposing the body and indulging in physical pleasure. Others believed that filth served as a protective barrier against evil spirits, or that illness was a divine punishment for sin and should not be interfered with. Thus, instead of washing, people prayed for deliverance or sought protection through charms and amulets. Despite these dire conditions, there were some medieval innovations in sanitation. The Romans had left behind aqueducts, sewers, and public baths in some regions, and a few cities, such as London and Paris, attempted to maintain rudimentary drainage systems. Monasteries were often more hygienic than towns, as monks adhered to strict rules of cleanliness and maintained private latrines, running water systems and herb gardens for medicinal purposes. The Crusades also brought Europeans into contact with Islamic cities, where sanitation and hygiene were more advanced. Returning Crusaders brought back knowledge of soap, perfumes, and better bathing practices, but these luxuries remained out of reach for the majority of people. In the end, medieval sanitation was a grim reflection of the era's ignorance about germs and disease. The average person lived surrounded by filth, inhaled foul air, drank contaminated water, and suffered from chronic illness. Life expectancy was shockingly low, with many dying before the age of 30 from preventable diseases or infections. The streets teemed with rats, the wells reeked of decay, and the stench of human waste permeated every corner of daily life. For those who survived infancy and childhood, enduring such conditions was simply part of existence, a miserable but unavoidable reality in a world that had yet to discover even the most basic principles of public health. Medieval food was as much a reflection of one's social status as it was a matter of sustenance. The diet of the average peasant differed drastically from that of the nobility, and while the wealthy feasted on lavish banquets of exotic meats and delicacies, the poor subsisted on a monotonous diet of bread, porridge, and gruel. The availability of food varied significantly throughout the year, and a bad harvest, severe winter, or plague could plunge entire communities into starvation. For the common peasant, bread was the cornerstone of the diet, but it was far from the soft, airy loaves we know today. Medieval bread was dense, coarse, and often filled with impurities. The lowest quality bread was known as black bread, made from barley, rye, or oats. It was heavy, hard, and difficult to digest, and it sometimes contained ground acorns, beans, or even sawdust to stretch the supply. Only the wealthy could afford fine white bread, made from wheat flour that had been sifted and refined. Porridge and gruel were other dietary staples, particularly for those too poor to afford even black bread. Porridge was made by boiling grains, such as barley or oats, in water or milk until they formed a thick, pasty substance. Gruel was a thinner, more watery version of porridge, often flavoured with herbs or a sprinkle of salt. For peasants, this was breakfast, lunch and dinner, with little variation. Meat was a rare luxury, and most meals consisted of little more than bread and a bowl of gruel. In regions with fertile land, peasants could supplement their diets with vegetables grown in small kitchen gardens. Onions, leeks, garlic, and cabbage were common crops, along with beans, peas, and turnips. These vegetables were often boiled into soups or stews, as cooking in large cauldrons was the simplest method of preparation. Seasonings were minimal, as salt was expensive and spices were prohibitively costly for the lower classes. The lack of refrigeration meant that fresh produce had to be consumed quickly, and the concept of preserving food was limited to salting, drying, or pickling. Meat was reserved for special occasions or for those who could hunt. Wild game such as rabbit, deer, and boar could be caught by those with access to the forests, but hunting rights were typically reserved for the nobility. Poaching was a serious crime, punishable by fines, imprisonment, or even death. For the peasantry, meat was usually limited to small birds, fish, or the occasional pig slaughtered in winter. Every part of the animal was utilized, from the organs to the bones, which were boiled to make broth. Dairy products such as cheese and butter were more common than meat, but still considered valuable. Milk was not consumed in large quantities, as it spoiled quickly without proper storage. Instead, it was used to make butter or cheese, both of which could be stored for longer periods. Cheese was often heavily salted to preserve it, resulting in a hard, crumbly texture. Fresh milk was considered a delicacy, reserved for children or the sick, while buttermilk, a byproduct of butter churning, was more commonly consumed by the lower classes. The nobility, in stark contrast, enjoyed elaborate feasts that showcased their wealth and power. Their tables groaned under the weight of roasted swans, peacocks, pheasants, and even whales. Exotic spices such as cinnamon, cloves, and pepper were imported from the East at great expense, and these spices were used liberally to flavor meats and sauces. The concept of show dishes was popular among the elite, where food was prepared and presented in dramatic, ostentatious ways. Birds were skinned, cooked, and then reassembled with their feathers to appear alive. Pastries were shaped into castles, boats, or mythical creatures, and the more extravagant the presentation, the higher the host's status. Wine flowed freely at noble banquets, as did ale and mead. While peasants drank weak ale as their primary beverage, water being unsafe to drink, the rich indulged in imported wines from France, Spain, and Italy. These wines were sweetened with honey or flavored with spices, and they were served in elaborate goblets adorned with gold and jewels. The wealthy also enjoyed a variety of sweet pastries, puddings, and fruit tarts, often flavored with almonds, saffron, or rosewater. Sugar was a rare and expensive commodity, imported from the Middle East, and its use was a clear indicator of wealth. Feasting among the nobility was more than just a matter of nourishment. It was a political and social event. Lords and ladies used banquets to impress guests, forge alliances, and demonstrate their power. The host was expected to provide an abundance of food, far more than the guests could possibly consume, as a sign of generosity and affluence. Music, dancing, and entertainment accompanied these feasts, with minstrels, jesters, and acrobats performing for the guests. But while the wealthy indulged in such excess, the poor were left to struggle through periods of scarcity. The agricultural calendar dictated food availability, and during the hungry gap in late winter and early spring, supplies ran dangerously low. Fields lay fallow, last year's harvest was depleted, and fresh crops had yet to mature. During this time, even black bread became a luxury, and people resorted to eating whatever they could find: wild plants, acorns, bark, and sometimes even animal bones ground into flour. Famine was a constant threat, exacerbated by poor harvests, natural disasters, and warfare. A single bad crop could spell disaster for entire villages, leading to widespread starvation and outbreaks of disease. Grain reserves, if they existed at all, were controlled by the local lord, who could choose to hoard supplies or sell them at exorbitant prices. Starving peasants had little recourse but to beg, steal, or subsist on whatever scraps they could scavenge. In such times, bread was adulterated with filler ingredients such as sawdust, chalk, or clay to make it stretch further. This famine bread was not only tasteless but also nutritionally deficient, leading to malnutrition and digestive problems. Those who could not afford even this meagre fare might resort to eating rats, dogs, or whatever vermin they could catch. Religious fasting also played a role in medieval diets. The church mandated that certain days be observed as meatless days, during which the faithful were forbidden from consuming meat, eggs, or dairy. Lent, the most significant fasting period, lasted for 40 days, during which time people subsisted on fish, vegetables, and bread. The wealthy could afford to import exotic fish or season their food with expensive spices. But for the poor, Lent was simply another period of hunger. Despite the scarcity, medieval cooks were surprisingly resourceful. Herbs such as thyme, rosemary, and parsley were used to flavor soups and stews. Honey was employed as a natural sweetener, and vinegar added a sour tang to otherwise bland dishes. Pies were popular because they allowed cooks to encase less desirable cuts of meat in a pastry shell, masking the taste and extending the food's shelf life. Root vegetables such as turnips and carrots were boiled or roasted, while fruits like apples, pears, and plums were dried or preserved in honey for later use. Food preservation techniques were primitive but essential for survival. Meat was salted or smoked to prevent spoilage, while fruits and vegetables were pickled or dried. Grain was stored in granaries, though rodents and mold were constant threats. Those fortunate enough to own livestock might slaughter a pig in the winter and salt the meat for use throughout the year. Eggs could be preserved in lime water, and milk was churned into butter or cheese to prevent it from spoiling. Ultimately, medieval food was a reflection of one's place in the rigid social hierarchy. The rich dined on peacocks and spiced wine, while the poor gnawed on coarse bread and boiled turnips. In times of abundance, the nobility revelled in sumptuous feasts, but for the vast majority of people, every meal was a struggle to stave off hunger for one more day. Food was more than just sustenance. It was a powerful symbol of privilege, survival, and the stark divide between those who had plenty and those who had nothing at all. Medical knowledge in the medieval period was rudimentary at best, a chaotic mixture of ancient theories, superstitions, and religious beliefs that often did more harm than good. While some physicians were genuinely educated in the classical teachings of Hippocrates and Galen, most healers relied on dubious methods, folk remedies, and religious rituals to treat ailments. The lack of scientific understanding of disease, combined with unsanitary conditions and widespread ignorance, made the medieval period a dangerous time to fall ill. The medical practices of the time were heavily influenced by the ancient Greek theory of the four humours. According to this belief, the body was composed of four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each humour corresponded to specific elements, seasons, and temperaments, and maintaining a balance among them was considered essential for good health. When a person fell ill, the imbalance of these humours was thought to be the cause. Thus, treatment focused not on curing the disease itself, but on restoring this delicate equilibrium. One of the most common and alarming treatments was bloodletting. The rationale was that removing excess blood would rebalance the humours and restore health. Physicians used sharp knives, lancets, or special bloodletting tools to open veins, allowing blood to flow freely. Alternatively, they applied leeches to draw blood from specific areas of the body. Monasteries often kept a supply of leeches for this purpose, as they were considered more controlled and less traumatic than open incisions. Bloodletting was a risky procedure, especially given the lack of sterilization and understanding of infection. Many patients suffered severe blood loss, fainting, or even death. Yet, it remained a widely accepted practice for centuries, applied to everything from fevers to headaches to the plague. Physicians believed that different veins corresponded to specific ailments, so a patient with a migraine might have blood drawn from the temples, while a patient with stomach pain might have blood drawn from the abdomen. If bloodletting failed to bring relief, physicians might resort to other drastic measures, such as purging or emetics. Purging involved administering strong laxatives or enemas to expel excess bile or phlegm from the body. Common purgatives included senna, aloe, and castor oil, all of which caused severe diarrhea. Emetics, on the other hand, induced vomiting to rid the body of harmful substances. These treatments were extremely harsh and often left patients dehydrated and weakened, making them more susceptible to infection and further illness. Cupping was another popular treatment intended to balance the humours. A healer would place heated cups on the patient's skin to create suction, drawing blood to the surface and purportedly removing toxins. The cups were often made of glass, horn, or metal, and the process could leave painful blisters or bruises. Dry cupping involved using the cups alone, while wet cupping involved making small incisions in the skin to allow blood to flow. The latter was particularly dangerous, as it increased the risk of infection and blood poisoning. Herbal remedies were also widely employed, though their effectiveness varied. Medieval herbals, collections of plant-based treatments, were passed down through generations and often included bizarre or dangerous ingredients. For example, mandrake root was used as a sedative despite its toxicity, and belladonna, a highly poisonous plant, was administered to relieve pain. Willow bark, however, contained salicylic acid, a natural precursor to aspirin, and did provide genuine pain relief. Physicians and healers also relied on astrological charts to determine the best time to administer treatment. The alignment of the planets and stars was believed to influence health, and some physicians refused to perform bloodletting or surgeries unless the celestial bodies were in favorable positions. Astrology was not merely a superstition. It was considered a legitimate branch of medicine, with physicians studying complex star charts to diagnose and treat patients. In addition to astrological influences, religious beliefs played a significant role in medieval medicine. Illness was often perceived as a punishment for sin or as a test of faith, and religious figures like priests and monks were frequently called upon to heal the sick. Prayers, relics, and pilgrimages were considered as vital to recovery as any herbal remedy or bloodletting session. The relics of saints were particularly revered, with believers flocking to shrines to touch or kiss objects, said to possess miraculous healing powers. Monasteries functioned as rudimentary hospitals, offering care to the sick and poor. Monks and nuns, who could read and write, were among the few educated people in medieval society, and they preserved and copied medical texts from ancient Rome and Greece. Monastic infirmaries were relatively clean compared to the outside world, and they cultivated herb gardens to supply medicinal plants. However, even in these more advanced settings, treatments were often crude, and the understanding of disease remained superficial. Surgery was a last resort, and was typically performed by barber surgeons who had little formal medical training. Barber surgeons were so named because they not only cut hair, but also performed minor surgical procedures such as tooth extractions, lancing boils, and amputations. Surgical tools were primitive, consisting of knives, saws, and cautery irons, heated until red hot to sear wounds shut. The concept of anesthesia was virtually non-existent, and patients were fully conscious during surgery, often restrained by assistants to prevent them from thrashing in pain. Wound care was equally rudimentary. Open wounds were treated with poultices made from honey, vinegar, or animal fat, substances believed to draw out infection. Unfortunately, the lack of understanding of bacteria and proper hygiene meant that many wounds became severely infected. Surgeons sometimes packed wounds with moss or animal dung, which not only failed to prevent infection, but actively introduced new pathogens into the body. The treatment of fractures was similarly crude. Bones were set using wooden splints bound with strips of cloth, and broken limbs were sometimes encased in clay or plaster to immobilize them. However, without knowledge of proper alignment or infection control, fractures often healed improperly or became gangrenous. Amputation was a common outcome for severe injuries, and in the absence of painkillers, the procedure was agonizingly brutal. Mental illness was poorly understood and frequently attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment. Sufferers of mental disorders were often subjected to exorcisms, fasting, or public humiliation as a means of curing them. Those deemed incurable were sometimes locked away in asylums, where they endured horrific conditions and cruel treatment. Despite the many dangers and misconceptions of medieval medicine, some advancements were made during this period. Medical schools emerged in cities like Salerno and Montpellier, where scholars translated ancient Greek and Arabic medical texts into Latin. These texts introduced concepts such as dissection, surgical techniques, and the importance of cleanliness, though it would take centuries for such practices to become widespread. Additionally, some medieval physicians began to question the efficacy of bloodletting and purging, advocating instead for milder treatments such as diet, rest, and herbal infusions. These early skeptics laid the groundwork for the more scientific approaches that would develop during the Renaissance. Nevertheless, the vast majority of medieval people had little access to trained physicians or sophisticated treatments. For them, falling ill was a terrifying ordeal, a descent into a world of pain, suffering, and ignorance. The stench of infection permeated the air, the cries of the sick echoed through filthy streets, and death was a constant looming presence. To survive even the simplest ailment was a matter of luck as much as treatment, and for many, medieval medicine was less a source of healing and more a grim reminder of their vulnerability in a world where life was cheap and death was never far away. Sanitation in medieval times was almost non-existent by modern standards, and the consequences of poor hygiene were severe and far-reaching. Cities and villages were breeding grounds for filth, disease, and parasites, and without proper waste management systems, the streets were often littered with refuse, animal waste, and even human excrement. The pervasive stench of rotting garbage, stagnant water, and unwashed bodies filled the air, creating an atmosphere ripe for the spread of infectious diseases. In urban areas, the lack of sanitation was particularly glaring. Streets were typically narrow, unpaved, and crowded with people, livestock, and market stalls. There were no organized waste disposal systems, so people simply tossed their garbage out of windows or into the street. Animal carcasses, spoiled food, and human waste accumulated in the alleys, forming a thick, foul-smelling sludge that attracted rats and other vermin. Rats, in turn, carried fleas that spread deadly diseases like the bubonic plague. The medieval toilet, or privy, was a rudimentary affair. For the majority of the population, it consisted of a simple hole in the ground, or a wooden bench with a hole cut in it. Some households had chamber pots, which were emptied into the streets or into open cesspits located behind homes. These cesspits were little more than deep holes filled with excrement and waste, and they emitted a nauseating odour that permeated the surrounding area. For those who lived in castles or monasteries, the facilities were slightly more advanced. Castles often had garderobes, small enclosed rooms with a stone or wooden seat positioned over a chute. The waste dropped down into a moat, river, or cesspit below. While this system provided some degree of separation between waste and living quarters, it still posed significant health risks. The chutes were rarely cleaned, leading to blockages and overflowing waste that seeped back into living areas. The smell was atrocious, and flies swarmed the openings, spreading disease. Public latrines were occasionally found in cities, but they were generally filthy and poorly maintained. These communal facilities offered little privacy, and they were often shared by dozens or even hundreds of people. Without regular cleaning, the floors became caked with excrement, and the walls were smeared with filth. In some areas, rivers and streams served as open sewers, with waste dumped directly into the water supply, contaminating drinking water and spreading diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. Bathing was not a common practice for most medieval people, and the concept of personal hygiene, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. Many people went months or even years without a proper bath. When people did bathe, it was typically in rivers, lakes, or large wooden tubs filled with heated water. The wealthy had access to private baths, but the poor made do with communal bathhouses, which were often shared by entire neighbourhoods. Bathhouses were popular social gathering spots, but they were also breeding grounds for infection. Water was not changed between baths, so each bather essentially soaked in the accumulated dirt, sweat, and bodily fluids of everyone who had used the tub before them. Communal bathhouses also attracted prostitutes, and they became associated with immoral behaviour. leading some church authorities to denounce them as sinful and dangerous. The church played a significant role in shaping attitudes toward cleanliness. While some monastic orders emphasized regular washing as a form of spiritual purity, others considered excessive bathing to be a sign of vanity and indulgence. The idea that water could carry diseases was not widely understood, and many people believed that exposing the body to water would open the pores to bad air, or miasma, allowing sickness to enter. As a result, some people opted to cover themselves in perfume or wear layers of clothing to mask body odor rather than bathe. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were constant companions for medieval people, regardless of social status. The wealthy attempted to control infestations by using scented herbs and flowers, such as lavender and rosemary, which were thought to repel vermin. They also wore layers of linen undergarments, which were easier to wash than woolen outer garments. The poor, however, had little recourse against lice and fleas, and infestations were a grim fact of life. Homes were rarely cleaned, and floors were typically covered with rushes or straw, which absorbed spilled food, animal droppings, and human waste. These rushes were only changed periodically, and the decomposing material beneath them became a breeding ground for vermin and disease. In wealthier households, fresh rushes were sometimes mixed with fragrant herbs to mask the stench, but in poorer homes, the floor covering became a festering layer of filth. In rural areas, people relied on wells, streams, and rivers for drinking water, but these sources were often contaminated by human and animal waste. Livestock roamed freely, and their droppings seeped into the water supply, carrying harmful bacteria and parasites. During heavy rains, waste from cesspits and open sewers washed into rivers, spreading diseases downstream. Boiling water could reduce the risk of infection, but firewood was scarce, and most people drank water straight from the source, oblivious to the dangers. Waste management in medieval cities was minimal to non-existent. Some towns had designated waste collectors known as rakers or gong farmers, whose job was to clean out cesspits and cart away refuse. These workers faced appalling conditions, wading waist-deep in human waste to shovel it into carts. The waste was then transported to the outskirts of town and dumped in open pits, where it festered and attracted swarms of flies. Despite these efforts, waste disposal was often neglected, and streets remained choked with filth. The stench was overwhelming, especially in summer when the heat accelerated the decomposition of waste. The spread of disease was inevitable, and outbreaks of plague, dysentery, and typhus were common. In 1348, the Black Death swept through Europe, killing an estimated 25 million people. The unsanitary living conditions in crowded cities provided the perfect breeding ground for the plague, which was transmitted by fleas carried by rats. The authorities attempted to impose some degree of order by enacting ordinances that prohibited the dumping of waste in the streets or the disposal of carcasses within city limits. However, enforcement was lax, and the problem persisted. Some cities installed rudimentary drainage systems or designated areas for waste disposal, but these measures were rarely sufficient to address the sheer volume of filth produced by a growing population. Religious festivals, fairs, and markets further exacerbated the sanitation problem. Large crowds gathered in town squares, bringing with them livestock, food vendors, and performers. The aftermath of these events left the streets littered with animal droppings, spoiled food, and human waste. The cleanup was minimal, and the putrid remains were left to decompose, contributing to the foul stench that permeated medieval towns. Ultimately, medieval sanitation was a deadly paradox. People feared water, associating it with disease, yet they drank contaminated water every day. They shunned regular bathing but lived in squalor, surrounded by filth. They believed illness was caused by sin or bad air, yet their streets overflowed with the very substances that spread infection. In a world where death lurked in every cup of water, every open cesspit, and every flea bite, survival itself was a constant struggle against unseen and poorly understood dangers. The squalor and stench of medieval life were not just unpleasant, they were lethal. Medieval society was a rigidly structured world where social mobility was almost non-existent, and your place in the hierarchy was largely determined by birth. The feudal system, which dominated Europe during the medieval period, was a deeply entrenched social order consisting of several distinct classes, each with its own set of duties, rights, and limitations. The system was structured like a pyramid, with the king at the top, followed by powerful nobles, knights, and at the very bottom, the peasants, also known as serfs or villeins. The lack of social mobility meant that most people lived their entire lives within the class into which they were born, regardless of talent, ambition, or intelligence. For the vast majority of people, life as a peasant was a brutal, back-breaking existence. Peasants made up approximately 90% of the population, and they were the backbone of medieval society, working the land to produce food and goods that sustained everyone else. Despite their essential role, they were treated as little more than property, tied to the land they worked and subject to the whims of their lord. Most peasants lived in small, cramped cottages made of wattle and daub with thatched roofs. These homes were dark, smoky, and draughty, with dirt floors that became muddy in the rainy season. Livestock often shared living quarters with people, as animals provided warmth in the cold months and served as a source of valuable manure. Peasants were obligated to work the Lord's land several days a week, tending crops, ploughing fields, and performing other agricultural tasks. In addition to working the Lord's land, they also had to cultivate their own small plots to feed their families. This left little time for rest, leisure, or education. The labour was relentless and exhausting, and peasants had to endure the harsh conditions of both summer heat and winter cold without the benefit of proper clothing or sturdy footwear. In exchange for their labour, peasants received protection from the Lord, but this protection often came at a steep price. They were required to pay taxes in the form of grain, livestock, or other produce. And they were also subject to various fees and fines, such as fees for using the Lord's mill, oven, or winepress. Even upon death, peasants' families had to pay a death duty to the Lord. These payments, combined with poor harvests and unpredictable weather, could plunge peasant families into destitution. Above the peasants were the knights, a warrior class sworn to serve and protect the Lord in exchange for land, known as a fief. Knights were bound by the code of chivalry, a set of principles that included loyalty, bravery, and the defense of the weak. In reality, however, knights were often as ruthless as they were honorable, engaging in brutal warfare, raiding neighboring lands, and enforcing the Lord's will with an iron fist. Training to become a knight began in early childhood, with boys of noble birth serving as pages and squires before undergoing a formal knighting ceremony. Knights lived in more comfortable conditions than peasants, residing in stone manor houses or small castles that provided greater protection and security. However, life as a knight was fraught with danger. Warfare was a constant threat, and knights were expected to fight for their lord whenever called upon. Injuries sustained in battle were common, and medical care was primitive, leaving many knights with lasting disabilities or disfigurements. Nobles occupied the tier just below the king, and they wielded considerable power and wealth. They owned vast estates, collected taxes from their peasants, and held the authority to administer justice within their domains. Noble life was characterized by luxury and privilege, with grand feasts, fine clothing, and ornate castles. However, this opulence masked the underlying instability of noble life. Noble families were constantly vying for power and influence, and alliances were fragile, shifting with every marriage, inheritance, or political maneuver. The threat of assassination, betrayal or armed conflict was ever present, and nobles were often embroiled in deadly feuds that could decimate entire families. The king, as the highest-ranking member of the feudal hierarchy, held ultimate authority over the realm. In theory, he owned all the land and granted portions of it to his most trusted nobles in exchange for loyalty and military service. However, a king's power was not absolute, and his rule depended heavily on the support of his vassals. A weak or unpopular king could be deposed, and history is replete with examples of kings who were assassinated, overthrown, or forced to abdicate. At the bottom of the social pyramid were serfs, a distinct class of peasant bound to the land they worked. Unlike free peasants, serfs could not leave the manor without the lord's permission, and they were effectively the property of the landowner. They could be bought, sold, or traded along with the land, and they had few legal rights or protections. Serfs were required to work long hours in the fields, ploughing, planting, and harvesting crops. In addition, they had to perform other duties, such as repairing roads, building fortifications, or tending to the lord's livestock. Despite their hardships, some serfs managed to save enough money to buy their freedom, though this was rare. Free peasants, known as freemen, had slightly more rights than serfs, but they still lived under the constant shadow of poverty and famine. A single bad harvest could spell disaster, and the risk of starvation was a constant concern. Religion played a crucial role in maintaining the feudal order, as the church was one of the most powerful institutions in medieval society. The church taught that the social hierarchy was divinely ordained, with each class serving a specific function in God's grand design. The clergy, who included priests, monks, and bishops, held immense influence as they were responsible for interpreting God's will and administering sacraments. For the lower classes, religion offered a measure of comfort and hope in a harsh and unforgiving world. Churches and monasteries provided charity to the poor, and the promise of eternal salvation served as a coping mechanism for those enduring suffering and hardship. However, the church also demanded tithes, or mandatory donations, which placed additional financial strain on peasants already struggling to survive. Merchants and craftsmen occupied a unique position in the medieval hierarchy, residing outside the strict feudal structure, yet still subject to its rules. As trade expanded, towns and cities grew, creating opportunities for skilled artisans, blacksmiths, weavers, and bakers to earn a living. While some craftsmen prospered, others faced stiff competition and fluctuating markets, leading to periods of economic instability. Guilds emerged as powerful organizations that regulated trade, set prices, and maintained quality standards. Membership in a guild provided a degree of protection and economic security, but it also required years of apprenticeship and adherence to strict rules. For ambitious craftsmen, guild membership offered a rare chance to rise above their birth status, but success was far from guaranteed. Despite the rigidity of the social structure, the medieval period was not entirely devoid of social mobility. Some peasants managed to save enough money to buy land, while a few knights and merchants amassed significant wealth and gained noble titles. However, these instances were the exception rather than the rule, and most people remained trapped within the social class of their birth. In essence, medieval society was a tightly controlled, hierarchical system that reinforced the power of the nobility while keeping the majority of the population in a state of perpetual subservience. The lack of social mobility, coupled with the constant threat of war, famine, and disease, created a world where life was uncertain, oppressive, and often brutally short. The idea of knowing one's place was not just a social expectation, it was a matter of survival. The rigid class structure dictated every aspect of life, from the work one performed, to the clothes one wore, to the very food one ate. For most medieval people, The dream of a better life remained just that, a dream, unattainable and out of reach. In the medieval world, sanitation was virtually non-existent by modern standards, and the consequences were devastating. Cities and villages lacked proper sewage systems, and human waste was often dumped into the streets, rivers, or open pits. This created an environment ripe for the spread of disease, with filthy conditions that made the medieval period one of the most dangerous times to be alive in terms of health and hygiene. Medieval people had very limited understanding of germs, bacteria, or the ways diseases spread. The prevailing medical theories were based on ancient beliefs, such as the imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And superstition played a significant role. People often blamed illness on divine punishment, evil spirits, or bad air, miasmas, rather than poor sanitation or contaminated water. This lack of scientific knowledge meant that preventative measures were minimal or ineffective, and treatments were more likely to cause harm than to cure. In towns, narrow, winding streets were often clogged with refuse from daily life. Waste from homes, including leftover food, animal manure, and human excrement, accumulated in heaps or was tossed out windows onto the streets below. Animals like pigs, dogs, and rats scavenged among the filth, spreading contaminants further. The stench was overwhelming, especially during warmer months, and this fetid environment was a breeding ground for disease-carrying pests. Public bathhouses existed in some regions, particularly in larger cities, but their popularity fluctuated and they were sometimes shut down due to fears they promoted immorality or disease. When they were available, these communal baths offered some relief and hygiene, but access was limited, and many poorer people never enjoyed even this modest cleanliness. Water sources were another major problem. Wells and rivers provided drinking water, but were frequently contaminated with waste. Without filtration or treatment, the water became a vector for deadly illnesses such as cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. Drinking polluted water led to recurrent outbreaks of gastrointestinal diseases that could wipe out large portions of towns or villages. One of the most infamous health disasters linked to poor sanitation was the Black Death, which struck Europe in the mid-14th century and killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. The bubonic plague was transmitted by fleas living on rats, which thrived in the squalid, overcrowded conditions of medieval cities. The plague's rapid spread and horrific death toll highlighted the dangers of medieval living conditions, though at the time no one understood the exact cause. Beyond the plague, other diseases were rampant and deadly. Smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, leprosy, and scurvy were common afflictions, often aggravated by malnutrition and harsh living conditions. Medical care was rudimentary and frequently harmful. Treatments included bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and superstitious rituals. Surgeons had little training, and infections were common after even minor injuries or surgeries. Without antibiotics or effective antiseptics, many wounds became fatal. Personal hygiene was challenging to maintain. People rarely bathed regularly, partly due to the scarcity of clean water and also due to cultural beliefs about the dangers of water opening pores to evil spirits or illness. Teeth brushing was unheard of, and bad breath, tooth decay, and gum disease were widespread. Clothes were washed infrequently, and lice infestations were a persistent nuisance. Living spaces themselves contributed to poor health. Houses were cramped and dark, with poor ventilation. Smoke from indoor fires, used for cooking and heating, filled the small rooms, causing respiratory problems. Bedding was shared with animals or insects, increasing the risk of infection. Even in castles or monasteries, which were relatively cleaner and better maintained, hygiene was limited. Stone floors and thick walls did little to prevent the accumulation of dust and dirt, and latrines were often rudimentary pits or chutes emptied outside castle walls. Monks tried to maintain cleanliness through regular washing and ritual purity, but these efforts were exceptions in a generally filthy world. The cycle of poor sanitation, malnutrition, and disease created a harsh reality for medieval people. Many died young, and life expectancy was low. Infant mortality rates were extremely high, with many children not surviving past their 5th birthday. Adults often succumbed to preventable illnesses that would be easily treated today. Epidemics could decimate entire communities, leaving survivors to struggle with food shortages and social disruption. Despite these grim realities, people in medieval times adapted to their circumstances with a resilience born of necessity. Folk remedies, herbal medicines, and local healers provided some relief, and religious faith offered comfort in times of suffering. Communities developed rituals and practices to cope with disease and death, even if their understanding of health was limited. In summary, medieval sanitation was a nightmare by modern standards, with filthy streets, contaminated water, and a near-total lack of public health infrastructure. These conditions contributed to widespread disease and death, making survival a daily struggle. The absence of scientific knowledge and effective hygiene measures meant that illnesses spread unchecked, and medical treatments were often ineffective or harmful. Life in medieval times demanded toughness and endurance, as people faced constant threats from their environment, many of which stemmed directly from the terrible state of sanitation. In medieval times, food scarcity was not just an occasional inconvenience. It was a relentless, often brutal reality that shaped the lives and survival of nearly everyone. The medieval agricultural system was primitive by today's standards and heavily dependent on weather, soil fertility, and manual labor. Crop failures, natural disasters, and poor harvests could quickly lead to famine, which struck with devastating consequences. Unlike modern societies, medieval communities had little to no safety nets or food reserves that could reliably cushion the blow of a bad year. The majority of the population were peasants, tied to the land and dependent on subsistence farming. They grew grains like wheat, rye, and barley, which formed the backbone of their diet, often made into coarse bread or porridge. Vegetables, legumes, and some fruits were consumed seasonally, but were generally less important than grains. Meat was a rare luxury for peasants, reserved mainly for festivals or special occasions. Most people supplemented their diet with eggs, dairy, and wild game when possible. But overall, medieval diets were monotonous and lacked variety. Even when crops were plentiful, the quality and nutritional value of food could be poor. Bread was often baked with whole grains and bran, making it dense and difficult to digest, sometimes contaminated with dirt or insects. Poor storage techniques meant that grain and other foodstuffs were vulnerable to pests like rodents and insects, which would consume or ruin significant portions of the harvest. Spoiled food could lead to food poisoning and malnutrition. Malnutrition was common and had serious health implications. The medieval diet often lacked sufficient protein, vitamins, and minerals, weakening immune systems and making people more susceptible to diseases and infections. Conditions such as scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, and rickets, caused by a lack of vitamin D, were widespread. Children were particularly vulnerable, and many died young due to poor nutrition combined with the harsh living conditions. Famine was a recurring nightmare. When a harvest failed, the consequences rippled through the community. Food prices skyrocketed, and even staple foods became scarce. Starvation, weakened bodies, and desperation often led to social unrest, theft, and violence. Historical records are filled with accounts of people resorting to eating whatever they could find: roots, bark, and even dead animals. In extreme cases, cannibalism was reported during times of prolonged famine. Feudal lords and the church often controlled the best lands and resources, leaving peasants with poor quality soil and limited access to food. While lords might stockpile grains and preserve food for their households, peasants lived hand to mouth. Taxes and rents owed to the lord further strained the peasantry's ability to feed themselves adequately. In towns and cities, food scarcity also posed challenges. Markets could be unpredictable, and supply lines were fragile. Local wars, banditry, or poor weather could interrupt trade routes, limiting the availability of imported goods or specialized foods. Urban dwellers often relied on bread, salted fish, and preserved foods like pickles or salted meats, but these were insufficient for maintaining good health. Seasonality dictated much of what people ate. Fresh fruits and vegetables were only available for part of the year, while preservation methods like salting, smoking, and drying extended the usability of meats and fish but altered their taste and texture. The reliance on salted or preserved foods could lead to additional health problems, such as hypertension or scurvy. For the wealthy, life was somewhat different. Nobles and royalty had access to a wider variety of foods, including fresh meats, exotic spices, and imported delicacies. Banquets displayed their wealth and power, with elaborate meals that might feature multiple courses and rare ingredients. However, even they were not immune to the broader effects of famine or food shortages, especially during times of war or political upheaval. The church played a significant role in medieval food culture, dictating fasting days and dietary restrictions that influenced when and what people ate. Lent, for example, required abstaining from meat for weeks, forcing people to rely on fish or vegetarian dishes. These religious rules shaped daily eating habits and sometimes intensified food scarcity during fasting periods. Food scarcity also influenced medieval social and economic structures. It reinforced the rigid class system where the poor struggled to survive on meager rations and the rich lived in relative comfort. It fueled migrations and rebellions as starving peasants sought better opportunities or protested oppressive landlords. Moreover, the constant threat of hunger shaped medieval mentalities and cultural expressions. Fear of famine permeated folklore, literature, and religious teachings. Miracles involving food, such as loaves and fishes, or divine provision during times of scarcity, were common themes that reflected the deep anxiety surrounding sustenance. In sum, the constant battle against hunger and food scarcity defined medieval life in profound ways. It influenced health, social dynamics, cultural practices, and even the political landscape. To live in medieval times was to face the unpredictable whims of nature and human systems that often failed to provide the most basic necessity, enough food to survive. The struggle to avoid starvation was a daily reality, and many did not succeed, making the medieval era one of the harshest chapters in human history when it came to the fundamental act of feeding oneself.